sour when the seasons change. Shit don't smell like flowers. Sunshine turns to rain. It takes a number. It takes a number. It takes a number. It takes a number.
Hello everyone and welcome to Forge Talks presents Natalie Bennett. I just need to let you know there are 3 fire exits. You've got 1 to the left of me and 2 just behind on the right. Just let you know any disrespectful behaviour you will be removed from the crowd. And I hope you have a good night. Thank you.
That's the fine thing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Forge Talks event. We have Natalie Bennett, former leader of the Green Party here. So the first thing I'm going to start off with saying is you're here in Sheffield in the Students' Union. Why Sheffield for your next endeavours?
Okay, well, Sheffield, I visited a great deal when I was Green Party leader. Had a lovely time, found it was a great city, and it's a place I'm looking forward to living in. But also, Sheffield is the place, Sheffield Central. We finished second here in the general election in 15. We had this was our 3rd highest vote in the country here in Sheffield Central. It's a great chance to elect the North's first Green MP. You know, I think that if Brighton Pavilion did it, I reckon Sheffield can do it too.
So you mentioned about the general election, and there was a huge swing to the Greens. It was something like 20% here in Sheffield. What can you do to push it just that little bit further so that you will become the next candidate,
Okay.
the next MP?
Well, I have to sort of correct that slightly in that it's not a little bit further. It's still a long way further. It's still a mountain to climb. But the reality is I think people really do want a different kind of politics. You know, we're seeing that in good ways and in bad. If we think about the American situation, obviously Donald Trump, but also Bernie Sanders very nearly got selected as the American presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. That was a huge shift in politics. If you look at the fact in the general election last time, as you said, we got 1.1 million votes. That was more votes than we got in every previous general election added together. So of course we've got an utterly failed first past the post electoral system that's really tough to beat and really unfair, but we've shown that we can beat it with Caroline Lucas elected in 2010. So this is really, Sheffield can be the next step, and I think an important step forward for the north of England.
I think we should go on to the first past the post system, because it clearly has its problems. But what would the Green Party propose as the alternative method for the vote system?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in terms of what system we need, you can spend a lot of time debating the detail, but let's start with the principle, which is we need a fair voting system where you can vote for what you believe in and get it, so everyone knows that their vote counts. One of the interesting things about the recent referendum, as very much I and the Green Party didn't like the result, the fact was everyone's vote counted for the same. And we need to get to a voting system for Parliament that works in the same kind of manner. So that's what it has to be, that's the definition. In terms of what it looks like, I mean, we've already got both in the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly and the London Assembly, what's known as the additional member system, AMS. And that means that people still keep their local elected MP, although roughly the constituencies get double the size, but then you have a list vote that tops up, so ensures the result's proportional. And that's something that, it's interesting, those three institutions that I named, they've all been created in the last 20 years or so. No one would actually start to create institutions now and draw up anything like our current unwritten British Constitution. I mean, I haven't even started on the unelected House of Lords.
Yeah.
I was in Marrakesh talking to some European young representatives of European youth, as in continental Europe, and I said to them, and we have the unelected House of Lords, and they just kind of went, that's what the rest of the world thinks, and they're right.
Is there what do you think should be in the House of Lords then? Because it still has its place, but clearly not elected isn't the right thing.
No, I mean, they should be elected. They should be elected through a proportional system. Now, what you don't want is a mirror of the House of Commons. You don't want something that just, replicates it. So the kind of system you could have would be to, say, elect people for one 10-year term. You can't get re-elected. You elect half of it every 5 years, and you can't then run for any other political position. So it wouldn't be a place where you would build a political career. It would be a place where you could actually, finish your career either from politics or elsewhere. And one of the things people say is great about the House of Lords at the moment is, you have perhaps former police commissioners, you have former brain surgeons, you have people with a whole lot of specialised expertise.
What sort of eligibility would you say for the House of Lords? Would there have to be some eligibility, or could anyone?
Well, what I think, an interesting way that you might perhaps replicate that kind of specialist knowledge, because one of the things about that is that, yes, you do have those people and they bring their specialist skills, but the ex-police commissioners also vote on NHS matters, and the ex-brain surgeons vote on police matters. So, it's not a perfect matchup. But what you could do is allow the members of the House of Lords perhaps to hand a speech, if they wanted to hand this opportunity for a speech, to an outside expert. So if you as a member of the House of Lords thought this is a really specialist area, say about the NHS, we want to do this differently, invite someone to speak for you to really address the nuts and bolts of a technical issue. And that would be one way you bring the expertise in without having our current unelected, really 18th century style patronage system.
Okay, so as we started with, we're in Sheffield, and you said you've been to Sheffield lots of times, but at some point in the past, I can't remember when exactly, you had a placard that said this is a clegg-free zone. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, that was actually going back to the 2015 general election, and that was because what we found was happening in Sheffield Central as we were campaigning was lots of people were saying to us, oh, but we've got to vote Labour to get Nick Clegg out. But they lived and were voting in Sheffield Central, not Sheffield Hallam. So we wanted to make sure that people were drawing a very clear line between the two and saying, in Sheffield Central, there was no risk of Tories getting in, there was no risk of Lib Dems getting in. It was a straight choice, as was proven, between Green and Labour. And that's what the situation will be whenever the next general election is, that straight choice between Green and Labour.
So do you think there is a place for the Green Party to come through with people like Labour being further left than ever before? Do you think there is somewhere for the Greens to come through?
I think that there's two things to say about that. One is the fact that, the thing about the Green Party is if you vote Green, you always know what you'll get. Our policies, our principles, our values are solid, reliable, consistent. we have always been opposed to fracking. We have always been opposed to trident nuclear weapons. We are consistently the people who've said we should be welcoming refugees here to Britain. We should be welcoming the refugees from Calais. So we're consistent and reliable. Always know what we'll be saying. You know what we'll vote for. And the second thing to say is that there are still major philosophical differences between us and even Corbynite Labour, because where we start from, the founding position of the Green Party is that you cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. We have to work within the fragile limits of this planet. And that means we can't keep chasing growth. And the whole idea of growth as the foundation of our economy is based on the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. If the pie is bigger and bigger, then even if you've got a tiny slice, your slice will get a little bit bigger. We can't operate like that anymore. We need a different kind of model, a model that ensures everybody has real security, has a real sense that you don't have to worry about putting food on the table, keeping a roof over your head. And one of the things that I think a key Green Party policy is universal basic income or citizens' income. And Jonathan Bartley, one of our new co-leaders, will be coming to Sheffield next week to talk about that in policy in detail. And I think that really demonstrates how the Greens see things differently. That we can't look back to a sort of 20th century model of an economy where people work in big industrial workplaces. We need something different to get security. We need to make sure everybody is not left penniless at any time. And the reality is so many people are being left penniless now, whether it's 0 hours contracts or whether it's benefit sanctions.
So you touched a little bit on the refugees and the migrant crisis. And with people like Donald Trump coming in who are, have very strong opinions, what do you see should happen in the future?
Yep. Well, I think in terms of immigration, these are huge pressing problems. And we need to start from the fact that we actually need a world. We need to be able to imagine a world in which nobody is forced to become a refugee. Nobody is forced to flee their home, whether it's because of climate change, whether it's because it's war, because of conflict, whether it's because of they simply can't get enough food to feed their families. Nobody should be in that situation. That's where we want to get. But we're an awful long way from that place at the moment. And while we are where we are now, first of all, we think about, the children, even just the children at Calais. They've been dispersed around France. Many of them feel like they were promised they were going to be allowed to come to Britain. Actually, Britain isn't delivering on that promise, and I think that's tragic and disastrous. Britain also should be welcoming our fair share of the refugees from around Europe. And then all of Europe needs to actually be ensuring there's an orderly resettlement program for people who want to come to Europe, so they don't have to risk their lives in the Med, as they're still doing. The figures for last week were 245 dead. And I've just been to the Marrakesh climate talks, and I went to Marrakesh by train. I went down by train, and catching a ferry across the Med, it's really very disturbing and shocking, because I was in Tangier, I handed over my 20 or so pounds, hopped on an air-conditioned ferry. Hours later, I was in Morocco. And that's a crossing that's claimed tens of thousands of lives, that people have been in the most desperate fear, states of desperation and struggle and death on that very simple crossing across the Med.
Do you think after things like Brexit, do you think the general public's opinion has been skewed somewhat, and that maybe there is no way of getting back people's mindset that we should help them? Or do you think we've gone down a bad path and it's going to be difficult to get back now?
No, I think, what we've had is we've had a whole dialogue, a whole approach from our right-wing newspapers, from our right-wing politicians, and I'm afraid also from some who might describe themselves as left-wing, or some might describe as left-wing, that's basically blamed immigration for a lot of Britain's problems. And one of the things I find when I talk to people on doorsteps, a lot of people, if you say, what's the main thing you're concerned about? They may say immigration. And then you say, what do you mean by that? What's concerning you about immigration? And those people will say usually mainly one of three things: low wages, crowded schools and hospitals, or my kids can't get a council house, housing's too expensive. And my response to that is all of those things are perfectly rightful and reasonable concerns. You're absolutely right to say they're huge problems. Your life shouldn't be blighted by that. But they are not caused by immigration. They are caused by failed government policies. And just to sort of briefly run through those, low wages, we have an inadequate minimum wage that's inadequately enforced. One of the things I think still hasn't really sunk with the general public is the fact we have this new so-called living wage. I call it George Osborne's fake living wage. But it doesn't apply to people under 25. So, if you're under 25 and you're working and, you say to your landlord, hey, I'm under 25, I'd like a discount. Well, good luck with that. And if you go to the supermarket and say, I'd like a discount off my groceries, good luck with that. So we have an inadequate wage policy in terms of crowded schools and hospitals. Well, when I say schools, what's wrong with schools? I can really just kind of say Michael Gove, and that pretty well covers it. The NHS, we're privatising it. It hasn't got anything like enough money. The junior doctors are being treated with absolute disdain. You would almost think Jeremy Hunt's trying to drive them out of the country. And we've also got the situation with student nurses who are now losing their bursaries and ending up with £55,000 worth of debt. So those are those two things. And then we think about housing. And this probably is the one I have most arguments on Twitter about. People say, well, there's all those immigrants, they're filling up the houses. But the reason why we've got a housing crisis is a number of reasons. One, it's really worth saying that we have more bedrooms per person in Britain now than we've ever had before. So we have an inequality problem. We have quite often 2 people living in a 6-bedroom house, and then there's 6 people living in a 2-bedroom house. And then what you've also got is regional inequalities. I've been up on areas on the Wirral where there's whole streets of perfectly good houses where no one's living because there's no economic opportunities there. Then you've also got the fact, the biggest underlying fact, we've relied on the market to supply housing for decades, and the market simply hasn't supplied that housing. We haven't built the council homes, the genuinely affordable homes, and that's why we've got a housing crisis.
Okay, so we mentioned Brexit and the public voted, but did stepping down before the referendum, did that have an impact on the Greens campaigning?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, one of the things with the Green Party is I think the fact that I served to clarify, I didn't actually step down. In the Green Party, you're elected as leader for 2 years, and so I served my second 2-year term and then decided not to re-stand.
But could you have re-stood and, maybe would it have had a different impact on the referendum if you'd stood for another 2 years?
I don't think so, because the model of leadership in the Green Party is quite different. It's not a greasy pole where you scramble up and then cling on by your fingernails until wrenched off. It's a shared out role, as indeed we're now demonstrating by having co-leaders, the first party to have had co-leaders. And as I think you can see from my presence here, I've stepped down as leader, but I'm not going away from politics. I'm still doing full-time politics. So it's actually adding to our capacity, it's growing our capacity. And that's what we need to do when you think about the fact that those 1.1 million votes last year, in a fair electoral system, we'd have 25 MPs. But because we've got the current electoral system, we still only have 1 MP. So we've got to find creative other ways to bring people forward and give them provenance. And I would say that I'm really proud of the Green Party campaign during the referendum. And I think actually lots of objective outside observers said ours was the one campaign that soberly and sensibly addressed a whole range of issues, things like the environmental protections from the EU, things like the protection for workers' rights that come from the EU. And also I think one of the key things really that we tackled that no one else did, certainly from the other parts of the REIGN campaign, was the issue of sovereignty and democracy. And I got in the Daily Express, which is not something that happens very often, because I said on LBC radio that the EU is arguably more democratic than Westminster is. Being the Express, they dropped the arguably out of the sentence. But nonetheless, I'll actually stand by the claim that the EU is more democratic than Westminster, because we elect our MEPs through a fair proportional system. Could be fairer, but it's pretty decent. We also have, one of the things the EU has is better checks on its spending, far better checks on its spending than the British Parliament does. Just before the referendum, the OECD came out with a report which said that Britain, among developed countries, has some of the worst, the most non-existent checks of the Parliament checking how the government spends its money. So we had all this focus in the referendum on EU budgets and spending, but actually the EU is far, far more transparent in its spending than the British government is.
So Brexit has happened. Do you think there is a chance that we won't leave the European Union because of, things that happen? And do you reckon we will actually leave? Will it be a hard Brexit, or will there be compromises made? What do you think will honestly happen?
I think at the moment we are in a state of considerable political turmoil in Britain. One of the things that I quite often go to continental Europe, I was at the French Green Summer University, and I said to them, they said, what do you want us to do? What do you as Britain and British Greens need? And I said, what Britain needs is time. We need to sort out our total political mess. Because I think, this week we had the memo that came out from inside the government saying there is no plan, it will take 30,000 civil servants, we don't know how to do this, help. And that really demonstrated, what's been increasingly clear, that Theresa May doesn't have a plan. All she's got is a mantra. Brexit means Brexit, Brexit means Brexit, Brexit means Brexit. And it doesn't take us very far. And so, where we'll end up, I don't know. I think anyone who told you they know where we end up from where we are now, is just making things up, basically. I mean, what I hope will happen, what the Green Party is very much campaigning for, is whatever the actual technical framework, I think there's three things we really need to do. We have to defend, speak up for free movement, which also ties in things like the Erasmus program, the opportunities that can enrich people's lives, enrich the possibilities of people's lives, whether they take them up or not. We need to keep in the protections of the single market. So that's all those environmental protections, workers' rights protections, etc. And what we could and should be doing right now at this moment is actually saying EU citizens who are settled here, who have made their lives here, you will be able to live here and remain here under the same rules as you have now. And that, I think, is, there are so many people's families' lives where people are thinking, I just don't know, do I send my kids to school here? What happens if they start school here and in 2 years' time they can't continue? People who are thinking, we've already seen universities have been very hard hit with students, mature higher level students, MAs and PhDs, not taking up courses. We've seen people, just academics pulling out of jobs. So we really need to give people that security and certainty.
Okay, being as though the Green Party only has one seat in Parliament, is it difficult to accomplish your goals, and are they actually possible with such a small voice compared to, you have the Tories and Labour who seem to have a much bigger voice? Is it possible to achieve your goals?
Very much so, because I think two things to say about that. I mean, Caroline Lucas has been a massively effective MP, and effectively she's speaking for those 1.1 million people who voted for her. I wouldn't quite say she's been like the equivalent of 25, but somewhere pretty close to that, I think. And the other thing is to say is just because what politics looks like now doesn't mean it will be like the same as that in the future. I mean, I was actually looking back to an interview I did with Zoe Williams in The Guardian in 2013, and I was saying back then that the future of politics doesn't look like the past. And if you think about just how much things have changed just in the last couple of years, we've seen massive changes in British politics. We are no longer in a two-party system. And just because Labour and Tory have been the biggest party for the last century doesn't mean that's going to continue. Doesn't mean even in 5 or 10 years' time that it'll be like that. Everyone said when Donald Trump started his run for president, oh, this is a nice entertaining joke. Look where we've got now. Look at Bernie Sanders again. A man who self-identifies, has always identified as a socialist, very nearly won a major party nomination for the presidential race in the US. Things are shifting very fast, and that is a really good thing, because you look at the state of the world economically, socially, environmentally, politically, things can't continue as they are. They really have to change. And one of the ways in which they've got to change is, what we're seeing, this is really clear around the world, is the centre isn't holding. The idea of a centrist politics, which means we won't really change anything very much. We might just fiddle with a few things here and there, but we won't change things. people simply don't believe that's true, that's possible, that's desirable anymore. They want real change. So you really do have a division between, on one side, the UKIPs, and if we think about the French elections, much worse than UKIP in the world. And on the other side, you have Greens and people like us who believe in a policy of hope, an inclusive society, a society where we can actually improve our lives while we live within environmental limits. So actually, those are the two choices you've got left. The centre is really hollow and empty and really doesn't inspire people anymore. And I'm afraid that's sadly why we saw the result we saw with Hillary Clinton, who failed to inspire in the US presidential election.
So you say that the centre is struggling to inspire anyone. Do you think that the left is ever going to challenge the Conservatives, or do you think the Conservatives have the monopoly, as it were?
Oh, absolutely not. And I think one of the things is there were surveys out this week, and already people are sort of saying, well, Theresa May doesn't really seem to be in control, does she? And she doesn't really seem to know what she's doing, and the Tories are in an awful mess. So I think, what we're in a situation is people really are looking for something new, inspiring, exciting. And also I think what we're seeing increasingly, and today I was on the streets of Sheffield, where of course many people will be aware there's been a huge issue with the council and the private contractor Amy cutting down trees. And I was talking to some people there who said, oh, we've never been involved in politics. And then we went along to a council meeting and we were just horrified by just how inept and uninspiring and chaotic it was. And we want a different sort of politics. We're going to get involved in politics. So, I've got a message, particularly for young people, but really for anybody. Politics should be something that you do, not have done to you. And what we're seeing, at a very grassroots level here in Sheffield, is lots of people are very angry about the fact that trees, mature, healthy trees on their streets are being cut down, and that's making them get involved in politics. And, I'd say to university, students in university, even students in schools, start doing politics where you are. Start a campaign. If there's something at your university you think isn't right, start a campaign to change it. If you're at a school, and I make myself very unpopular with the teachers when I say this, but if you're a school pupil, you don't like something about the school, start a campaign to change it. Those are what we really need to do, is get everyone involved in building a better world, and that builds a different kind of politics.
So as someone who didn't start in politics, you started in journalism, did you find the transition from media to politics quite difficult, or did you find it quite natural?
I think there's certainly some advantages in coming out of the media into politics. I mean, obviously you sometimes have an idea where the person who's sitting in your seat is trying to go and what they're trying to achieve. I did once have a rather hilarious conversation with a Sun journalist. I happened to be walking around a Thai supermarket, and I spent half an hour on the phone to him on my mobile, and he was trying to get me to say something, and I was determined not to say it. And he didn't write the story in the end, so I regarded that as a victory. But I could kind of see where he was going. But so it's useful. But I think for me, I mean, I always knew that at some stage I'd get out of journalism. I did mostly international journalism. And it can get very depressing year after year, writing stories about African famines, writing stories about political instability in South America, writing what feel like the same quite depressing stories again and again. And so I always knew at some stage that I'd want to, rather than report the news, try and change the news. What was different, I think, was I would have expected to have gone NGO, United Nations, something like that sort of route. But I joined the Green Party on the 1st of January 2006, so it was a New Year's resolution to do something. And I never would have predicted where it would have led me.
Of course. And so as a journalist first and then a politician, do you think that gives you an insight as how to portray the party in the media? Did you have a bit of an insight into that then?
I think it certainly helped me to see sort of what the media wanted. I think one of the things what happened with the Green Party was it really with the Green surge, where we saw, membership of the Green Party more than quadrupled, and the amount of tension we got sort of suddenly changed virtually overnight. And that was something I don't think anyone expected or saw coming, and so that was a big shock. But I think it was certainly useful to bring those skills in. But I think often it's important to be not performing being a politician. It's important to simply be a person who's in that seat. So my first politics, and one of the things that I'm really passionate about is feminism. And that comes from the fact that at age 5, I was told, because you're a girl, you're not allowed to have a bicycle. And that was the point at which I became a feminist, even though I didn't know the word then. And bringing that passion into the politics that I'm doing, I think that in some ways is much more important than technical skills. In a way, kind of, Blairism and Cameronism were the ultimate triumph of technical skills of politics, of focus group politics, of smooth, very, very, very in control looking politics. Whereas, what we got with that was David Cameron, the man who made a small tactical decision to buy off the UKIP wing of the Tory party by saying he'd have a referendum on EU membership. And that turned out to be a massive strategic error with huge consequences. And, he's pretty well down as the worst Prime Minister in British history.
Do you think he is one of the worst?
In recent political history. One can go back a long way, but certainly in recent political history, he never really showed that he always wanted the job, but what he wanted the job for never became clear at all.
Yeah. During the 2015 general election, there was the televised debate with all 7 party leaders, and David Cameron said that he did want the Greens there. He wanted you to be there. Do you think that's because he wanted to have a fair representation of all the parties, or just because he wanted to split up the left-wing voters?
I think there's no doubt at all that he wanted it for his own political purposes. However, the reason why I think I got there was because the public very strongly wanted us there, and the public wanted us there because they wanted to hear a new voice, they wanted to hear different perspectives. So I think, David Cameron was making that argument entirely for his own purposes, no doubt about that. But we got there because the public came out massively in support of us being there.
And do you think you did a good job during the debates?
I think so. I mean, one of the things is that what really annoys me about the first debate is that people often said that they thought I was nervous. I wasn't, actually, but it's a case of how much technical training and skills you have. And one of the things that's quite different about debates to normal television like this is in debates you are supposed to stare down the lens of the camera and deliver your message to the audience at home. And for someone like me who's done a lot of groups like this, lots of schools, university visits, talk to audiences around the room, my natural instinct is to talk to people around the room. And that's what I did at that moment. And it didn't necessarily come out very well in the first debate. Whereas by the time I got to the second debate, I'd kind of learnt the technique, although not too much in an Ed Miliband kind of way, of delivering it down the camera. But naturally, not too stiffly.
Was it difficult to adapt to that sort of change of view?
Very much so, because from the first time you go on television, the first time you're interviewed, in the street, even for a vox pop, you'll be told, don't look at the camera, look at the person you're talking to.
Yeah.
And that's what you get told. And, if you're addressing audiences, in a hall, in a classroom or whatever, you look around and you talk to different people in the room and make sure everyone feels like they're included. So it's the absolute reverse of everything you've ever been taught. And that's quite a hard shift to make.
Yeah. So being under public scrutiny, is that difficult for you to maintain your personal persona? Do you have to, make a sort of extension of yourself when you know that you're going to be on screen? Or are you just naturally always yourself?
I think I always try to be myself. I mean, one of the things that I find is not just when you're on screen, is, I never know when I'll be asked for a selfie at any time at all. And, I'm perfectly fine with that. One of my examples from this is I, at the moment, live in a flat in London which has a balcony which is kind of basically open to public space. And I was out one Sunday morning watering my pot plants in a rather grubby T-shirt. It was Sunday morning, and someone popped out of the lift and said, "Oh, can I have a selfie?" My grin may have been a little bit fixed at that point and not entirely genuine, but generally I'm always happy to talk to people. That's how I am. I love the political debate and the political discussion, and I think at the moment people are so hungry for different answers. I mean, when I was at the climate talks in Marrakesh, just the riad, the sort of B&B that I was staying in, started talking to this Canadian who lived in America, and I could still be there talking to him because he just wanted to understand what was happening in America and the world and how were we like this. And, I love answering questions like that.
How much do you think being a politician is about being friendly and getting people on your side, or is it like if you just have good policies, you will go far? Or what do you think the balance is between the two?
I mean, I think you need those good policies, and I'm very proud the Green Party has utterly extensive suite of policies, and there's a whole lot of things like, for example, in education policy, not just zero university tuition fees, but also the fact that we have a vision of a different kind of education system, a schooling system that isn't like an exam factory where pupils are shoved through exam after exam after exam. Having that's really important, but the reality is what you've also got to paint a picture is of a different kind of world, and that's much more a big picture, not detail of policy, but big picture that says, just imagine the world where you leave university without a huge weight of debt on your shoulder, where you feel like you've had an education that prepares you for life. It hasn't just taught you about exams, but has also taught you about things like cooking, nutrition, first aid. Why do people leave school without having learnt first aid? Sex and relationship education. Imagine starting life with all of those skills, knowledge that you need, with a sense of security that you're going to be able to find a job that you can build a life on, a sense that you'll always be able to afford a decent home, that you'll be able to live your life with confidence. And we need to paint a picture of what that world looks like, because it's really important we give people hope. The other side, the UKIP side, is a politics of fear. We're the politics of saying, we've got lots of environmental, economic and social problems, but we can tackle all of those with policies that make our lives better. And that's really key. A better life is what we want to deliver.
So how much is the role of the Green Party to bring the green agenda onto the mainstream? Or is it just to win seats in Parliament?
I think very much both. And one of the things that I think if you look back over historically, you look at issues like, I've already talked about the living wage, and George Osborne conceded the principle, even if he didn't deliver the reality with the so-called living wage. Look at 20 mile per hour speed limits where people live, work and shop. Now, 10 years ago or more, we started campaigning for that, and people said, it's the radical Greens and their crazy ideas. Yet now what we've got is the City of London, the least radical place you could possibly imagine, is entirely 20 mile per hour speed limits. So we've certainly had a traditional role of proposing policies being seen as radical and far out, and yet sort of about a decade later they become the mainstream. But I think what's different now is we've got to the stage where we really can't wait for that process. We need the change, the radical change much quicker, and that radical change actually has to happen immediately, which means we've got to elect Greens, elect lots more Greens, to ensure we can deliver the change immediately.
You mentioned radical change. Do you think Donald Trump is the sort of radical change that is needed? Or what's your opinion on Donald Trump?
It probably won't surprise you for me to simply answer that question, no. I'm on record many times as saying that and this was before the election, that the idea of Donald Trump in charge of nuclear weapons is a deeply disturbing one, and it is a deeply disturbing one, but we are where we are. I think Donald Trump is a sign of the desperation of the electorate. People are absolutely desperate for change, and what they're doing is just grasping at anything that looks like change. And I think there's a real parallel with this in Britain. The Guardian had an article about a guy who was a homeless man in London, and he went to great lengths, great effort to actually go and vote for Brexit. And he voted for Brexit because he said, my life is so awful now, any change can't possibly be worse. And I think that's a perfectly understandable position, and that's the position that lots of Americans have voted for Donald Trump from. I think it's a terrifying position. One can only hope that Trump will only be a one-term president. What's going to happen
or
in
maybe
terms...
less.
Well, yes. He has some 300 court cases outstanding against him, I read somewhere. Having just come from the Marrakesh climate talks, of course everyone there was talking about the issue of Trump, what's he going to do on climate change, what's he going to do about the Paris Accord, what's he going to do about America's funding for mitigation. These are big critical issues, and we don't actually have any idea of the answer, because one of the things that's not perhaps widely known in Britain is that in 2009, Donald Trump was actually taking out adverts saying we have to act on climate change. So we have the Donald Trump of the past, we have the Donald Trump of the election campaign, and what Donald Trump as president will look like, who knows. But I think it's really important that we don't disrespect the voters and understand that really the voters are offering out a cry for help and saying, we desperately need change and we have to offer them the hopeful change.
So you mentioned Donald Trump and his views on climate change, and he has said at some point that he doesn't even believe in climate change, as do apparently half of Americans. Do you think that is, obviously that is a silly point of view, but how can you change people's mind on climate change if they are so sure that it isn't happening?
Well, I think one of the things is, I'm always mainly concerned with Britain. And one of the interesting things is Britain, right through, even through the period where you saw widespread questioning of the science of climate change in the right-wing media, where I'm afraid even we saw the BBC had a sadly very skewed idea of balance. So whenever they put on a green, they'd put on a climate change denier as some kind of idea of this was balance. Even in that period, we always had about 75% of British people said they understood that climate change was real and it was something that needed to be dealt with. So that's a real measure of the sense of certainly the British public. So I think the focus needs to be on two things really. One, on explaining to people that we can tackle this. And, having just come from Marrakesh and hearing lots of really exciting possibilities in terms of things that we can do about agriculture, as well as, of course, renewable energy, what we can do about transport, solar power and batteries as a combination is coming on in leaps and bounds. So there's lots of exciting things that can help us tackle climate change. But I think the other thing, the key message we need to get across is that tackling climate change and lots of other environmental issues, it doesn't mean that our life, we have to give up things or our life will be worse. There's so many policies, things like having a warm, comfortable, affordable to heat home for everybody. Do that, insulate every home in Britain that needs it, put energy efficiency measures in. That's something we treat the housing as part of our national infrastructure. We create tens of thousands of jobs. We create lots of opportunities for thousands and thousands of small businesses to thrive. We lift nearly everybody out of fuel poverty, and we cut our carbon emissions. It's an absolute no-brainer of an action. Again, think about public transport. Affordable, convenient, reliable public transport running when and where you want it. That improves everyone's lives. It tackles inequality because, for example, 2/3 of job seekers don't have access to a car. So the fact that we, in many parts of the country, have no or very poor public transport is a huge inequality issue. And it cuts our carbon emissions. So again, these are all things we need to do because we're not doing things very well now. We're trashing the planet and we're not giving people a decent life. I think if there's one figure that really sums up how much we've got things wrong, it's the fact that in the past decade, the rate of depression among under 16s has doubled in Britain. We are not creating a successful world by trashing the planet. We can stop trashing the planet and create a successful world.
There's obviously lots we could do to help save the planet, but when you have countries like America and China who are burning lots of fuel, is there anything realistically that Britain can do with us being so small?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to say about that. First of all, yes, we are only 2% of current greenhouse gas emissions. However, if you look at the historic emissions over the past couple of centuries, a lot of the carbon dioxide that's already up there we are responsible for. So we do have a historic responsibility, a moral responsibility. But also one of the things is our place in the world as a focus of media, as a focus of global attention, is actually the world follows what happens in Britain a lot more than it follows what happens in Belgium. So if we do different things, we can provide leadership for people in those countries, in China and the US, who are campaigning for climate change. What happens in Britain gets reported. And the other thing is to say is, there's a huge amount of misunderstanding about what's happening in both US and China. You look at coal consumption. I was hearing again and again in Marrakesh, people saying basically the US coal industry is on its last legs. And that's not because of climate change campaigning. It's not because of government policy. It's because of economics. basically solar is blowing coal out of the water economically, and that's why coal is disappearing from the US. And the other thing to say is about China. There was a theory, a suggestion that China was heading for its peak coal usage in 2030. Well, actually, it's not quite clear yet, but it's quite possible that China has already passed peak coal. For the last couple of years, consumption of coal in China, use of coal in China has been going down. And what works with this very well is the fact that China has a huge problem with air pollution, as indeed, of course, do we for slightly different reasons. But China has a huge problem with air pollution, and the public are getting really active and really concerned about this. Now, it's not always easy to see in a non-democratic country how this has an impact, but it certainly does have an impact. And campaigning against air pollution actually also practically means campaigning against greenhouse gas emissions. So that public pressure in China is hugely important to see the kind of change, the turnover that's happening. And, China is the absolute leader in solar. It's very much stepping out in onshore wind. It's very much leading the way in renewable energy technology.
And so do you think, for reasons like you mentioned, that countries like China could become the next superpowers and will take over from America and Russia, going back 20 years?
Well, I think one of the things that we're already seeing, it's an interesting what the definition of superpower might mean in the future. I actually wrote a piece about the climate talks in Marrakesh, saying that really what we're seeing is China is now the leader in pushing for global action on climate change. We saw an alliance between Obama and China last year in Paris. The US is now in a state of considerable uncertainty, and so it really is China that's leading. The EU is providing some valuable support. The Nordic countries in particular have some great models of what's actually happening in terms of renewable energy in particular, and also good social models of community ownership, etc. But really the leadership is with China. And that's what's sort of traditionally known as soft power. It's not warships or missiles, but it's people just looking to China and saying, what should we do? How are we going to tackle this? What do we need to do as the world? And, China is, partly because the US is abdicating, China is certainly stepping up to the plate on that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think right now we're going to throw over and have some questions from the floor. We've got a couple of microphones floating around. So are there any questions? Can we get a microphone there? And I think there was one over here. So we'll take two questions and then I'll let you answer both. So we'll go over here first.
So I know you have differences with the Labour Party, but would you ever consider doing a progressive alliance with Labour and SNP?
Okay, and then the question over here.
In light of today's events surrounding the tree protests, what is your view of them being arrested under the trade union law?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, to answer the second one first, for those people who don't know, we saw a couple of weeks ago 2 arrests under repressive trade union legislation, which is basically on the grounds of either obstructing someone in their work or causing them fear or apprehension. The arrests again this morning were on that basis, I believe. It is worth painting a picture of what happened here, because what happened in Sheffield this morning was from about 2 a.m, a whole line of houses, police started knocking on people's doors. This is sort of 2, 3, 4 a.m. in the morning. And of course, if that happens, people immediately think someone's died, something's terrible's happened. But actually the police were asking the residents of those houses to move their cars so the trees could get cut down. And at 5 a.m, the chainsaws started up. And what happened was then in the hour or two that followed, 3 people, 2 of them women in their 70s, were arrested under this repressive trade union legislation. I think that's absolutely despicable, and I'd really like to understand the thinking that suggests a couple of women in their 70s were causing apprehension and fear of the AAMI contractors there with their chainsaws in the trees. And I think there's a real question for the leader of Sheffield's Labour Council, to answer here, because after the first 2 arrests, she said that she was entirely opposed to the use of this trade union legislation against peaceful protesters. But she either must have known or should have known about the events of this morning, which was creating a situation where more people were likely to be arrested under that legislation. So I think there's a real question for the Labor Council to answer about that specific point, about the use of anti-trade union laws against peaceful protesters. On the Progressive Alliance question, the way I prefer to talk about this is Progressive Alliances, plural, because I think what we can see is in different parts of the country, the political balance is quite different. Now, for example, in Lincolnshire, where there's the Tories stood down and we're facing a parliamentary by-election there, the Greens there have decided to back a Save a Local Hospital campaigner. So we're effectively formed an alliance with the local Save Our NHS campaign. That's what seemed to be appropriate then. We've called on other progressive parties to join us. They haven't done so, but hopefully we might see that sort of thing happen in future. So I think we've got to work out how we change British politics. And we started off on the issue of electoral systems. And I think ensuring we need to get rid of the Tories, certainly, but we also need to create a fair voting system. And we've only got to once elect a parliament that's a majority for fair votes for proportional representation, and then we can change the system. So I think we should be working towards that, looking towards that, seeing how we can achieve that. And progressive alliances with different model and different shapes around the country is one way to do that, definitely.
Okay, any more questions? I see there's one at the back and there's one over here. So you ask the question first and then head over to the back, I think. Yeah, go.
Obviously, Donald Trump is absolutely outrageous in some of the things that he's said, but do you not think that one of the things that people are now searching for isn't necessarily something drastic and new, but truth, and that's what they think that he's brought?
Okay, we're going to go to...
Yeah, sure. I think there's a microphone somewhere over here.
Hi. Should there be this hypothetical snap election prior to the triggering of Article 50, would you be standing on a platform of opposing it or allowing it?
Mm-hmm. Okay. To start off with Trump and truth. Not two words I usually hear in the same sentence very often. I don't know whether people are looking for truth so much. I think what people are really looking for is hope and hope of change. I think people know the truth about, say, for example, climate change. I think people probably know the truth about one of the big problems in our society is that big multinational companies aren't paying their taxes and are parasites on the rest of us. I think people do actually know a lot of stuff. Sometimes perhaps they know it more in their gut than they've thought through the whole things in their head. But I don't think truth is not the problem. People can find truths for themselves. What they need is a sense of hope for the future. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is some surveys which have been done for decades, asking people, do you think your children and grandchildren will have a better life than you've had? And those surveys are the results are increasingly negative. So what we've got is people don't really believe in the future. People don't believe in the status quo. So they really understand a very fundamental truth. The problem is how we offer them a hope that they can really grab onto and follow and believe in. That's the challenge, I think. Sorry, and I've entirely forgotten what the second question was.
Sorry, I've forgotten the second question as well. Do you still have the microphone?
Sorry.
That's all right. I was asking if this...
Brexit. Sorry,
Yeah.
yes, I did. I saw your baseball cap, and it immediately came back to me. I think what we'll be standing on a platform is what I said before in terms of whatever the framework it takes. We want to keep free movement. We want to keep the protections of the single market. Now, I think the possibility of a second referendum has to very much be on the table, because when people voted for Brexit in the first referendum, we had no idea what type of Brexit people were voting for. They had no idea what type of Brexit they were voting for themselves. So I think you need to keep that second idea on the table. Now, the problem with that is that if you've invoked Article 50, and I think it's important to tell people the truth about this, if you've invoked Article 50, so for every reading that I've seen that seems believable to me, says that to then have a second referendum after you've invoked Article 50, you will have to get the agreement of 27 other European states. That's difficult, and it means there'll be a price attached to it. So it's important that we understand that, we get that as the place we're at. But I think, if we were to get to a negotiation, the point that we're arguing for, which is keeping free movement, single market, then actually, you have to ask yourself the question, that's roughly the Norwegian model. What's the difference between the Norwegian model and membership of the EU? The difference is you're signing up to a whole lot of things you have no democratic say over in the Norwegian model, whereas membership means you have a democratic say over them. I think we could have an interesting referendum on that basis.
Okay, more questions. There's one here, and there's two at the front. Let's go for these two at the front.
Hi, I'm a Year 13 politics student, and in my bag with me today I actually have the course booklet that we're given, and the 4 topics that we're covering is fascism, liberalism, conservatism and socialism. However, there's other chapters in the book such as environmentalism, feminism and multiculturalism that we don't even touch on. Do you think the political education should be widened so that 16, 17-year-olds are taught more about politics so that they know what they're voting for if they are given the vote?
Very much so. I think everyone should have a good political education. And again, Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, has a PSHE bill, Personal, Social, Health and Economic Education bill. And that includes a right to ensure that you get educated about your rights and responsibilities as a citizen. That's really important, but I'd actually go further than that in terms of preparing people to be citizens, to be active citizens. I want to see schools being more democratic. I think if you actually have a situation within schools where people are actually able to make decisions for themselves democratically, if you elect some class reps who then make some serious decisions about how things work in the school, you've really learnt about elections in a practical, real kind of way, and you're much more likely to then to continue your involvement in politics. So I think we need much better political education, we need broader political education, but we also simply need democracy in schools that would then prepare people. If you're an active student in the democracy in school, you're then prepared to be an active citizen.
And then we have a question right here.
Hi. Oh, God. You talked very much about people desperately searching for change and the kind of change we've seen in even the past 6 months with Trump and Brexit, etc. You say a lot of that has been driven by very popularist right-wing figures that people appeal to because they, for the most part, speak very simplistic rhetoric that inspires people. Do you feel that's where the left-wing parties tend to lose out, is there's slightly less of these popularist figures that appeal to people who have been, for the large part, very apathetic in the past?
I think there's a couple of problems. One being that those sort of right-wing demagogue figures tend to present a very, very simple picture of politics. I mean, if you summed up the basic, I was going to say the basic position of UKIP, but actually it really was the entire position of UKIP. It was stop immigration and leave the EU and everything will be wonderful. And I don't have a message that simple because I understand the world isn't anything like that simple. But we certainly do have to, boil down our messages, create that picture, paint that picture that I was talking about earlier of, a society that works much better in which no one fears not being able to put food on the table, a roof over their head, a society that works for the common good in which we don't have big multinational companies that are parasites not paying their taxes. But again, I'm getting more complicated. And the challenge is to boil it down really, really simply. And we need to do more of that. But I think we also need to respect people and address them as adults and address the broader complexities. And that can ultimately be a more inspiring kind of politics, a more popular kind of politics. What I want is a popular left-wing politics, not populist, but popular. And I don't think, there is a real philosophical problem here because, I don't believe in the single outstanding leader. I want to make everybody a leader. But I think it's possible to do that. I think there are politics that do that. There are places in the world that achieve something very like that, very much on the way to that. So I think it's possible to do something different. I think one of the challenges in Britain that I don't quite know how to overcome is the fact that, of course, so many people are working such long hours. With the cuts in public services, lots of people have caring responsibilities for the young and the old. It's very hard for people to find the space in their lives to do politics. But as I think we saw this evening in Sheffield between 4 and 6 on a wet, very cold evening, there was perhaps 100 people standing on the street saying, we want to defend this tree. They were people who'd found the space and the time to do politics in their lives. And if we can make it direct and meaningful to people's lives, then what we can see is get people engaged on that kind of level. And it starts from the grassroots very much.
Okay, more questions. There's quite a few over this side. There's someone at the back, and then there is the people in the techie team, if they want to have a question. Should we go for this one first? Yep.
You mentioned when you were talking about climate change that the BBC would sometimes put a Green Party candidate on and a climate change skeptic. Do you think that the BBC's need to be impartial affects its ability to give accurate reporting on scientific issues like climate change, where there's usually a global scientific consensus?
I don't think it has to at all. I mean, I think the BBC has really been quite supine in the way it's reacted to pressure from right-wing media sources. And I'm in a difficult position here because I very much believe in the BBC. I believe in a public sector broadcaster. I believe in a publicly funded broadcaster. But I don't think the BBC has often has failed to live up to its responsibilities. And it's not just on climate change. I mean, it's also the case, I think, that very often the BBC follows the rest of the media in reporting politics like it's a football game. You know, who won PMQs today? Who told, the jokes best? Who scored the points? And that, really doing the public, doing politics, doing democracy a disservice. So we have to defend the BBC and demand it does much better.
And then I think Ed has got one there.
You say that you have always been kind of considered a very radical party, and I was just wondering whether you thought, given the current predictions on climate change and the current data, whether the Green Party's policies are actually radical enough to make the difference we need to make.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think if you look at the Green Party's policies, I mean, the current kind of measuring framework is the fact that the Paris Climate Accord, and it is worth repeating this because it's been quite an attempt to bury it, agreed to try to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, that's now a hugely challenging target. But that's what every world leader signed up to. And if you look and go through the detail of Green Party policies, it is a radical transformation. And what we're proposing would be Britain's share of delivering that 1.5 degrees. We have to implement the lot now, which I think it sort of comes back to an earlier question of, do we need a general election now? I think we probably need a general election for all sorts of reasons. One of them is because we have to elect a government with the policies to deliver on climate change. And that is a pressing physical reality. Ultimately, when it comes to climate change, we're not talking about politics. We're talking about physics. The world isn't going to wait for the human race to get its act together politically. We need to act now.
Okay. Some more questions. Let's go for one over there, and then we've got a few over this side.
The Iraq war inquiry left the door open for those in government and politics to potentially be prosecuted for various reasons, such as misleading the public. Do you believe the people who led the Brexit campaign, such as Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and Nigel Farage, should be held more responsible for misleading the British public? And would you ever call for a similar inquiry?
I think they certainly should be held responsible for what they did. Whether the legal route is necessarily the right route. One of the things that immediately comes to mind is the fact that they're all people who could afford really, really expensive lawyers, which makes the legal route somewhat difficult, really, because I suspect the people likely to be prosecuting them would probably be the public interest people who'd have much less money for that. And whether that would be the best way to pursue them, I think we should pursue them politically. I think we should make sure that they're never elected to any elected office ever again. And that's the way they should be held responsible.
Okay, I think someone has the microphone over there.
So this is a question I find really difficult to answer myself. I'm a surfer and a beach lifeguard and love spending time in the sea and the natural environment that it is. As climate change continues to impact the oceans, we need to develop different methods of producing clean and sustainable energy. To what extent would you be willing to change the marine environment on our coastlines to produce this, with offshore wind farms, tidal turbines, and the like that would certainly impact on these natural reserves and habitats?
Well, I think it would have some impact, but there's a huge amount that we can do that won't have, will indeed have some positive impacts. And the example I'd cite is the Swansea Bay Tidal Lagoon, which is a really exciting proposal that was actually ready to start being built the spring before last. It was ready to being built last spring, and it would be ready to build this spring if the government got its act together. And this tidal lagoon will certainly cause some damage, but it will also create some great new habitats for lots of species that would really thrive in those habitats. So I think there's a lot that you can do. And I think about, in terms of offshore wind farms, there's some negative effects, certainly, but then again, you're also creating some positive spaces for marine life and some protected spaces for marine life. So I think there's a reasonable balance there. There might indeed be some damage to be done, but that's where I think you also need to make a really important point on the whole energy policy, that the best possible energy you can have, the cleanest, greenest, best energy, is the energy you don't need to use. And a huge amount of the energy that we use on a daily basis is actually wasted. It doesn't make our lives any better. I was at a meeting about fracking in central London, and it was about 8 p.m. in the evening, and we were on the top floor of illegal offices. And I just invited everyone to look around, and around us were all these buildings lit up like Christmas trees. And there's nobody in any of those buildings. So we waste a vast amount of energy. So where we should start with energy policy is conservation, ensuring we only use what we need, and then we'll actually need much less to have those impact on marine and other environments.
Okay, a few more questions. We've got one in the middle here and one over that side as well. Oh, in fact, there's someone with a microphone currently. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, go on, with the microphone now.
Hello. So earlier you referred to sort of the BBC reports on PMQs with who's won PMQs, point scoring. This is a bit of a broad claim now, but hasn't politics always been and will always continue to be a point scoring system where it's one versus the other? Why have the Green Party decided to stand back and not engage in that in any way, instead of engaging in it and getting their voice heard in a conventional way?
Well, first of all, I would say that if you look at Caroline Lucas in PMQs, she's got some pretty good hits in there. I recall a particular one actually in the Cameron days when the government was changing the curriculum for primary school pupils to have the most ridiculously detailed, complex grammar tests. And Caroline posed a couple of those questions to David Cameron, and he didn't know the answer. Now that is political point scoring, undoubtedly. So we do play the game because we have to play the game. There's no alternative to that. But I think what I would challenge is the assertion that it always has to be that way. And indeed, in fact, if you look at most of continental Europe, when I talk to continental European politicians, they're just horrified at the whole way British politics works. And the idea that we can have grown men, and it is mostly men, I think, grown men making chicken noises at each other across the chamber. And continental Europeans say, why is your politics like that? And one of my answers to that is because of first past the post. And because we have this division between two sides that are set up against each other like that. And one of the things is if you even look at the Scottish Parliament, elected under a proportional representation system, with a situation where you've mostly had coalition governments. And everyone knows that at some point in time they might have to work with practically anybody else. And there's real attempts, on some issues at least, to find consensus, to find a way forward that a broad range of people agree with. And that just creates a whole different kind of culture in which we can agree on lots of things that simply are, the experts say this is the facts, this is how we should operate. That operates on that basis. And it's not, Punch and Judy politics, it's not bish bash bosh. That's not how most of the world does politics. And we don't have to do it that way either.
And we have a question in the middle here.
Did 5-year-old feminist you get her bike?
Good question. Yes, I was about 12 or 13 when I had sufficient power in my family to ensure that I got a bicycle. And indeed, until I became Green Party leader, bicycle was my chief method of transport around London. Unfortunately, television interviews and looking like a drowned rat after you've been cycling through the rain don't fit together very well. So I haven't cycled a lot recently, but I'm going to get back to it.
I think there's a question over there. Go for that
one. Why do you think there aren't more politicians that have prominent journalism backgrounds? And do you think that a Paxman, a Koonsberg, a Robinson could be successful should they make such a transition?
I wouldn't necessarily seek more. I mean, there are actually quite a few. I'm afraid I'm going to have to mention him again. Michael Gove comes to mind. So there are quite a few people in politics with a journalism background. What I'd really like to see is people with much more varied kinds of backgrounds. I'd like to see bus drivers, school dinner ladies, people who work in factories, people from a whole broad range of backgrounds. And one of the things that we've really seen happen in the last perhaps 20 years in British politics is we've seen a real narrowing of the field from which people are drawn. We have the career politician who, there's very large numbers of them, went to Oxford or Cambridge, did PPS, went and became an advisor to a minister, in the late 20s, early 30s, get selected for a safe seat, and that's been their life. And I don't think that's a very healthy background. I'd like to see people from a much broader range of backgrounds. One of the things that a Green Party policy I'm particularly proud of is the idea of job share MPs, because it's pretty well impossible now for anyone with caring responsibilities to become an MP. It's an utterly all-consuming job. It's very hard for some people with disabilities to become an MP. If you introduce job share MPs, one of the ways in which you'd open up much more broadly to the possibilities of many more people becoming MPs, and that's what we need to do on a much broader scale. Our parliament is profoundly unrepresentative now. We need to make them much more representative.
Okay, I think we've got time for one or two more questions if they're quick, so we'll go for one over here.
With Brexit, like Trump and the rise of the far right, it's quite difficult to have hope sometimes. What's your practical suggestions and ways to get more involved and encourage other people to get more involved?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I said politics should be something you do, but I define politics very broadly. So I was at a sixth form college near Bradford, and we were talking about what they could campaign for in the school. And afterwards, they took me to lunch. And because I was, a VIP visitor, I got proper cutlery to eat my baked potato with. And they all had plastic knives and forks, which is basically useless to try and cut a baked potato with. And so I said to them, here's your first political campaign. Real cutlery in the canteen. This is good for the environment, less plastic. It's good for your quality of life. You get to enjoy your lunch. And so I would say, start with the things around you, start with the things that affect your life, and make a difference on that scale. And people often ask me, how could I get involved in politics? How could I become a politician? And you can study politics, sure, but I think, the best thing you can really do is do politics. The first campaign you run, the first petition you write, the first visit you make to lobby your politician, maybe you won't get it 100% right, but you'll learn a huge amount from the process. And, particularly if you can pick a winnable campaign and you've actually made a difference, then the skills you've learnt, what you've gained from that, you can then take onward and upward into bigger and bigger things. So I think, you don't have to, from today, start a campaign that entirely changes the whole world. If you change something about Sheffield University, change something about Sheffield, change something about the street you live in, improve that, then you've made a start towards a better world. And you can do that and see the success of that.
Okay, so how many more people are there? I reckon if we get a microphone over there and a microphone here, we'll ask the two questions and then answer them both. And then I think that's about all the time we've got left. Okay. Yes, let's get the question here first.
So with, for example, Jeremy Hunt, do you believe that he and, for example, the education secretary should have experience, for example, being a doctor or being a teacher, to be in those roles?
And then the question over here.
I was just wondering, just as you were saying before, you'd like to see people from a wider range of backgrounds involved in becoming MPs. Do you think the spiralling costs of living in London and the spiralling cost of being an MP restricts who can run for MP? And would you like to see, during the House of Commons renovations that are coming up, the House of Commons moving out of London and to maybe a northern city to maybe get more in touch with other voters?
Yeah, no, I think to take that one first, I think absolutely, the House of Commons is a really, really weird atmosphere. When you walk behind the scenes in the House of Commons, it's very rarefied. You've got this Victorian Gothic architecture. One of the things you find is the gender balance of the corridors is even worse than the gender balance of Parliament. And I think shifting the physical environment of Parliament would be useful. It's not going to be transformatory, but it would certainly be useful. And I think you're right in terms of, whether you bring it entirely to the north, the southwest might get a bit jumpy about that. Maybe Birmingham's a good sort of, Midlands, kind of middle of the road, everyone can get there reasonably easily sort of model. But, I think that would be a great way forward. And I think to address the question about whether people should be kind of qualified to be ministers of health or education or whatever, I don't think it's necessarily that they have to be qualified. I think it would be good if they'd actually shown some sign of interest in the subject before they get appointed to those roles. Some background in campaigning, some track record on parliamentary committees, that sort of thing. I don't think you necessarily want specialists per se, because specialists often have their own sort of pet subjects, pet areas that they want to focus on. What you need them to do is to actually listen to the experts who tell them things. And that's something, we have a government that simply doesn't listen to evidence, doesn't look at the reality. What we need is a reality-based politics. The reality of the world that we live in is that we have to live within the physical limits of our one fragile planet. The reality of the world we live in is that inequality is crushing our societies and crushing our economy. We need a reality-based politics that then tackles those problems rather than magnifies them.
Okay, Natalie Bennett, thank you very much. Big round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. This has been Forge Talks, and which way are the exits? Are we going out that way, I think? I don't know. That way. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much for coming.
Okay, I think we're setting up for a photo there.
E affiato se